So what do you do when ministry ends, but everybody else's life keeps moving? For a lot of pastors, that transition out of church leadership feels like stepping into unknown territory. Today, we're talking with Wes Gay, a former pastor who found himself navigating those same questions after being let go, not from one church, but from multiple churches. And so Wes now finds himself in the business world. He is a StoryBrand guide and has been. He's one of the OGs, and he's here to share practical steps that he took to move forward, the skills that he brought with him from ministry into the marketplace, and why the transition doesn't have to be as complicated as it might seem. If you're wondering what's next after ministry, this episode will give you some clear answers and some practical advice. Thanks for listening. This is the Life After Ministry podcast. Hey, welcome to the Life After Ministry podcast. My name is Matt Davis, and I'm here with the extraordinary Wes Gay. Hello, Wes.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me.
I don't know if you remember our first moment together. I do. My wife was driving. We were going on vacation. I had just become a StoryBrand guide and wasn't sure if this was really the direction I was going to go with my life. Somebody said, you should talk to Wes. He's the StoryBrand guide, and he used to be a pastor, and he'll solve all of your problems. And I sat there in the passenger seat of the car and listened to you and asked you a million questions, trying to figure out what was next.
I do remember that. I think the person who told you those three things, they got 2 out of 3 right. I don't know that I could solve all the problems. Maybe I create more than I solve.
Well, I just remember in the moment, I thought, this is good. Like, I think I might be able to make it. And I still feel that way. Every once in a while, I still feel like I might be able to make it. So it's good. You are in the marketing and messaging world within StoryBrand, and that's our connection. But you didn't always start out that way. Take us back.
So excuse me, my dad's a worship pastor. So I grew up in that world. We were in smaller Baptist churches, so it was usually music and. So he was, for most of the time when I was growing up, he was minister music and senior adults. So we had a lot of, I remember like this time of year when we were recording in September, we were 3 months into Christmas music by this point in our house with cantatas and the things. But he also spent a lot of our time around the senior adults because he took all the trips. Senior adults take the best trips in churches, by the way, and it's not even close. But grew up in that and then went to a Christian college, got a music degree. I still can't tell you why. I can see the diploma on the wall right now, Bachelor of Science in Music. I have no idea why I did that. I think it was because I had played music, been a musician my whole life, didn't have any other idea of what I wanted to do. And so I got a music degree and then went straight out of that into a nonprofit that I had worked at every summer in college down in Florida. Went to work for them for a year, and then my time there came to an end. And one of the guys that had worked there I'd become really good friends with, he was our COO, and he was an associate pastor at a church here in the Atlanta area. And he said, hey, we've got an opening. Love to have you come join the team. So I was like, great, I'll do that. Why not? That was 2010. Yeah, 2010. And then did that and was at that church until 2013. And then 6 weeks before my wife and I were supposed to get married at that church, I got fired and didn't know it. Later, he came about 3.5 years later. He apologized because he realized the reason he made the decision, he was actually wrong. The information he had was wildly incorrect, and so he apologized, but the damage had been done. So obviously,
how does somebody get fired and don't know about it?
Hopefully the short answer to that question is things had been kind of oddly coming to a head, and I didn't know why. Things were going well. I mean, there were some things we were trying to wrestle through. Situationally, it was kind of an odd season, but he and I had a somewhat of an awkward conversation on a Friday. And he said, you know what, take the next week off. Let's just kind of figure out where the next steps are. I was a student pastor at this time, been in that role about 8 or 9 months. And he said, it might be a better fit if you look at, we really got to do something for like young singles, college. We're seeing a growing population in our area and we're not doing anything for them. Okay. He said, so take next week and just kind of figure it out. And so that was Friday. On Monday, I got a text from one of my friends on staff, said, hey, we just had an emergency staff meeting and found out you've been fired. This was Monday morning. And so Tuesday night, by this point, I had known the pastor and his wife I'd only worked at the church 3 years, but I'd known them for 7 or 8 years. I had done Christmas with their families. His mother-in-law loved me. Like I knew all of his kids, like all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And his wife texted me. He's like, I'm so sorry it came to this. I can't believe this is happening. And I said, and I just played dumb. I said, what are you talking about? And she said, what do you mean? I said, I don't know what you're talking about. 5 minutes later, the pastor texted me and was like, hey, we got to talk. I was like, I think we do. So it was super awkward. But left there and then moved back to my hometown. We got married. My wife and I did move back to my hometown. I was a bivocational pastor at a small church there, and also had a couple other jobs just as a transition season. We ended up moving a year later back to Atlanta, got a job at a church here. And then there was a new pastor that came on staff a few months later. It started to be that inevitable transition of people are going to be gone. And I was one of the first ones. Within 6 months, there were 6 or 8 people who got let go. I was one of the first. And so people maybe listen to this and think, man, this guy's unhireable. But anyways, and then I was already talking to another church in the area because I knew I could sense things were coming to a head, and it was going to be just one of those senior pastors coming to town. We got to clean house so he can have his agenda under his quote administration. And so I, from there, transitioned to a new church, and it was a odd situation there too, because they brought me in for a role that had never existed before, and they thought they wanted it. 2 months into that stint, they decided they didn't want that role anymore, and they still don't have it 8 years later. And so I got let go. And that was really my kind of day zero, because I thought, I've got nothing else. Like, I have nothing else lined up. I don't know anybody. At this point, it sounds like from the outside, you've gotten essentially fired 3 times from the 3 churches you've worked at. No matter what the circumstances are, no matter that one of the guys came back and apologized because other people on staff had flat out lied, and that came to light. It just, when you're not the senior pastor and you get fired, it is very hard to recover. It's like you have a scarlet letter F when you're walking through town on your shirt. Senior pastor, you can do everything, just about anything, and still get rehired. And so, I just went to work. We were living in my mother-in-law's house. My wife, she was pregnant with our second, and then our oldest, who was a year and a half at the time, because the church with the new pastor, we had been living in a house the church owned. When the new pastor came to town, he decided he wanted that house, and we had 3 weeks to figure out something else. And so we ended up moving my mother-in-law. So we were already there. And I'm just trying everything. I'm talking to everybody I can, trying to figure out anything I can. I'm getting a few things here and there. People just feel bad about the situation. So I'm getting things where I'm like editing somebody's podcast for $25 an episode because I've got a production background. I had graduated from seminary with a Master of Arts the December before this. And so I reached back out to somebody, the provost of the seminary, told him my situation, said, we're thinking about coming back doing an MDiv, which is ridiculous. I never should have done an MDiv. And just kept like in this spiral. And then the funny thing is, in the middle of all that, I actually got contacted by Forbes.com to become a contributor for them. So I'm unemployed, can't find anything. I've only ever had really church and nonprofit jobs. All of a sudden, I'm a paid Forbes contributor. Like, this makes no sense. And then October 2016, my wife was a VA through what is now Belay Solutions, and her client had gone through the original StoryBrand online workshop 8 years ago. So he was on Don Miller's email list. And she was checking his email one day, and they had announced they were doing the StoryBrand Certified Copywriter program. I knew about StoryBrand probably a year before. The church I worked at, there was a guy who had been on John Maxwell's ghostwriting team, and Don had come and done a thing for John Maxwell then, when he was the only one doing those workshops. So I knew the framework. The podcast had just started. I've been following Don Miller since the mid-2000s and Blue Like Jazz. I read several of his books. I always liked as an author. And my wife was like, "You're a good writer. They say you're going to send you leads. Like, what else do we have to lose at this point?" And so I signed up on a Friday afternoon at 4:00, and I was in Nashville the following Monday at 9 a.m. Within 45 minutes of that first day, I thought, I think for once in my life, I'm in the right room. I'm doing the right things.
Well, was there a point before that? A point before that where you're thinking, I don't think I'm going back into ministry? And what was that like kind of metric for trying to figure that out?
The metric was I could not get a job. In that season, so it was like April of 2016 to October before I did the StoryBrand copywriter certification. I applied for dozens of jobs. I had a couple of interviews with a prominent church search consultants about jobs that fell through. A coaching company here in Atlanta that I was connected to. I thought about trying to work with them more, but it just didn't work out. I tried to do coaching, but boy, I had no idea what I was doing. I was way off base. I tried the thing going to seminary. I thought maybe if I can get an MDiv, I can get connected and work there part-time, full-time with somebody through the school and get an MDiv, which I have no business doing an MDiv for me. And honestly, it really came to about where, so this was probably August of that year. I'd had serious conversations with a church in Central Florida that was one of the churches in kind of a network of churches that I had attended and been part of when I lived there before I started working in churches, because a friend of mine was a worship pastor. So I played in the band with him and attended regularly and all that. And so one of their campuses needed an executive pastor because their executive pastor, had left to go plant a church in South Florida. I had great conversations, multiple interviews. They flew me down for a day to meet with their pastor and a couple other people, and great time. Fly back, and they're like, they came back 2 weeks later and said, "Hey, I just don't think this is going to work." They said, "We're actually just not ready to hire this role right now because the guy who left had been here since we started, and we're just trying to figure out what the role looks like now." Which I get. I mean, even now I realize like that's a valid thing. So probably 2 months later, they came back and said, "Hey, are you interested in kind of a part-time communications operational role?" It's kind of like an executive pastor administrator, but part-time, because we just don't think we're ready for full-time based on what our needs are. They're still meeting in a YMCA every week, that kind of thing. Said, sure. Had a great couple of conversations with them. They brought us down. My wife, it was now our 2-year-old, 6-month-old, and my wife and I drove down to Orlando one weekend, went to church on Sunday, had a couple of meetings that day. I had a meeting that day with their elders and the pastor, and then I had one more meeting that following day. We were looking at rental houses by this point. I had already gotten StoryBrand certified as a copywriter, and we're thinking, great, we'll get to here. I'll do this part-time, and then I'll do this copywriter thing. I'd already gotten a couple of clients 2 weeks in. I'll do this copywriter thing. Between those two, I'll have to work really hard, but I'll probably get a full-time salary out of that, and then we'll hold this over until I get a real job. They came back and said, actually, it's just, we don't think it's going to work. And I just found out recently, 8 years later, to kind of the more ridiculous part of this whole part of the story, I found out that somebody I barely knew had intercepted that conversation about us maybe going on part-time because he was a pastor in the same broader church planning network. Somebody I barely knew called the pastor that they were going to hire me, and it was set. Like they were like, I think we want to work with Wes. We like him. He's good, whatever. This guy I barely knew somebody had told him that we were having pretty awful marriage. We had a pretty terrible marriage, which we didn't. It was hard in that season. 2 kids in a mother-in-law's house, all that is it's a hard season. He'd been lied to. So he interfered on our behalf, and it cost us that job. And I just found that out maybe 6 weeks ago as we record. So that was hard. But it really came down to I just couldn't get a job anywhere. I'm too stubborn to know it, to see anything else.
What did you have to unlearn going from ministry into the marketplace?
I need to hydrate for this question. There's a lot. I think church staff makes a lot of assumptions about what life is like day to day, because I don't think so many people in ministry, particularly like executive pastors, not so much, like senior pastors, student pastors, teaching pastors. The pipeline is we go to high school, you go to Bible college, and then you go to seminary, and then you work in a church. And you don't have day-to-day, Monday to Friday job roles. The reality is Monday to Thursday is the work for most pastors. I realize there's some stuff happens, but Sunday, while technically able to work day, for the most part, church staff don't spend many more hours doing stuff on Sundays that volunteers do, which is going to ruffle feathers, but I don't care. At this point, one of the things I had to learn was just like what life was really like outside of ministry in terms of the work and what people experience. And I think it would do church staff a lot of good to find people they trust in their church that are deacons, elders, leaders, whatever, and say, hey, can I just kind of spend a couple hours at your job, just kind of shadow you, see what it's like, what you deal with and what it's like day to day? That would create a lot more empathy, I think, for churches and help them better understand the people that they're in their congregations. That's one of the things I had to unlearn. I think another one was, honestly, and I think, Matt, you and I may have talked this before, I had to unlearn about money. Because churches, especially Southern Baptist churches, have a tendency, I think, to only talk about money when we're getting ready for a campaign, building campaign, Annie Armstrong, Lottie Moon, missions offerings, or it's just a stewardship sermon because we're behind budget. Mm-hmm. And then you kind of grow up in a middle class situation. You don't talk about money that much. And, but yesterday as we record this, I was with a company that their corporate consulting company. They're in the middle of a $300,000 contract they just sold. It's like, and now that stuff is just easy to me. But before, when I first started, like hearing any kind of number was bananas. Like it just blew my mind. And so I had to unlearn what I thought I knew about money. And then also, honestly, I had to unlearn a lot of things about my faith. And I had to figure out, I think everybody who's in ministry needs to have an extended period of time where your paycheck is not directly tied to your faith. Because I think it's too easy to fall in those habits. of, well, this is my job and that's just it, instead of being really challenged to think and interact with people outside the church bubble.
Yeah, we talk a lot about this kind of framework of identity, assignment, and calling. And I think I've said this multiple times on the podcast, but if you asked me 10 years ago, tell me about yourself, I would say that I am a pastor, and it was both my identity and it was also my calling. And you realize on the other side of everything that it's really just, it's an assignment. This is what God has for you in that season. But yeah, you have to kind of unlearn and kind of figure out what does all of that look like.
I also think you have to, I think in some way, and this is probably because I was in ministry in my 20s, but I think a lot of times I see pastors and church staff will elevate their calling above every other calling in the congregation. But one of the things that I've really been fascinated by, that I've run across far more than I expected, is how many Christians I've met who own and run businesses that I work with. I mean, it's a lot. It's great. And I got a client I've been with almost 2 years now. They're great people. Their business will do $6.5 million this year in revenue. They're in a super specific niche in what they do. It's very technical, a lot of spreadsheets, which is not my world, but it's their world. I just help them sell their spreadsheet stuff. But the reality is, like, I deal with Christians a lot, and very committed, very faithful people who are trying to do good in their own world and steward what they have, steward their employees, their businesses, etc. And I think we forget that can also be a calling to serve faithfully in the marketplace. I remember years ago when I was on church staff, one of the church I was at, where I was a student pastor, we had a weekly Bible study on Monday nights. It started out being like the young adults. What it really became was the few young adults in our church, and then the younger adults from other local churches who were on staff and didn't have a small group to go to because all the small groups on Sunday mornings. And so me and another guy on our staff would kind of rotate who would teach based on just our schedules. And he might be preaching some. I preached occasionally in church, big church. I still call it big church.
Big church, yeah.
And so anyways, we were doing a series one time on Philippians. And I remember the study we were doing talked specifically about Lydia, who was one of the people that's noted, I think in Acts, about the church at Philippi, and how she was a seller of purple goods. And as the teaching unpacked it, that meant purple goods specifically meant that it was probably more of a luxury or high-end business. Mm-hmm. And she essentially was a CEO of a luxury goods company. And I remember that just kind of planted the seed in my mind of like, oh, there's literally instances in the Bible of churches were started and founded, and being the key contributors were very successful, prosperous business people. And I think we still, even in America, underestimate that, what power that has.
So we're talking to people who are coming out of ministry. They're already out of ministry. But if you were to go back in, because there's people who are still in ministry, if you were going to go back in, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently inside the walls of the church? And you could also speak to that, like from somebody who is working with churches and ministries and nonprofits, to see how they run. You see the dysfunction, and you see like where they're hitting their head against the wall.
Yeah. Well, let me first say, and this is, man, this might make people mad, but I don't care. I don't work with many churches, and it's not that I don't want to. I just have a hard time working with churches because so often on a church staff, a senior or executive or lead pastor will think they have to always be the smartest person in the room. And that lack of humility is hard to engage with. And I've had clients in the business side who are the same way. It never works. It never does. And so I just don't do it. So I've worked with a few very large ones over the years because they are more willing to learn. And that's partly how they got to have such an influence, is because they're willing to learn and not always be the smartest person there. But what I do differently, I would think more reasonably and say, hey, you know what? We can't just constantly have events and then be mad when people don't show up. We need to say, is this event going to be valuable enough that somebody's going to give up their Saturday, which is their one day a week left after we essentially take their Sunday away from them with all the things we expect people to do on Sundays? And if it's not valuable enough, we shouldn't even do it. Stuff like that. I would, that's one thing I would for sure do. In terms of personally, for people who are listening to this, they're also considering maybe leaving ministry, I would start spending some time essentially building a portfolio or kind of building a binder, literally or digitally, of like, what might I be able to do, or who do I need to know, or where could I off ramp here? I had a guy one time as an older guy. He had been retired. He'd been in ministry 40 something years. His dad had been a pastor for 50 years. And he said, you know what? I just always realized that nothing is ever secure in life. And he said, over the years, I would literally develop physical binders of plans, ideas, and actions of things I could implement or run with if I lost my job. He said, or if I had to have an on-ramp, because if he was a worship guy, so he said, if the senior pastor, there was some scandal and the church fell apart, I might need to hit the eject button. I didn't want to leave myself stranded. I would think more proactively about what can I do to prepare myself so that if I have to make the jump, it feels more like I'm jumping off the curb instead of jumping off the edge of a cliff.
That's good. You said 45 minutes into that first StoryBrand session that you were finally in the right room. And I'm just curious, like, what transferred over? Like you had a skill set as a pastor, leader in ministry, and now you're employing whatever this is that you have, God-given gifts, skills. Now you can use it somewhere else. What are those transferable skills that I think some pastors thinking like, well, all I got is the MDiv and all I have is, 15 years behind the pulpit or, doing slime games with the youth ministry.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been a youth pastor for 15 years and my only experience is making the administrator nervous, or having to force them to increase our insurance policy. No, I would say, and this is the same thing I run, and you probably do this a lot too with your clients on companies, is they'll say, well, how do we go get new verticals or get new audiences? What people often get hung up on, both in business and in ministry, is they think about the tactical things they actually do. I'm a pastor, which means what I do. I prepare a sermon, I lead a staff, I have to preach, I lead the deacons, manage budget, I'm responsible for all these things, et cetera. That's the tactical kind of practices of what you do. But take a step back from that and say, what are the principles that are really at play here? Well, for one, I think this is going to seem really shallow, but I promise it's not. If you are good in ministry, as in you can engage with people well, you're able to rally people around, whether it's giving season for like you're doing a big missions gift or a missions offering, or you need volunteers or people are willing to go where you lead. Quite honestly, that's a sales skill. You are selling people on ideas. In the business world, I would say one of the things I've seen pastors who transition out do really well in sales because they're used to it, learning how to connect with people really quickly. Even if you only got a church of 200 people, when you're standing at the back of that auditorium every Sunday on the way out and people are shaking hands, you're rarely talking to people for more than 10 seconds a week. But because you're their pastor, they expect you to know, they expect to feel seen, known, and understood by you. And you've got to do it fast. So I think pastors have really strong empathy muscles that are kind of fast twitch. Like they can understand that they can connect really quickly, which is a huge asset in the business world, particularly in sales. So I would look at what are the things that you do on a regular basis that are also that you're really good at. So if you're great at communicating and preaching and preparing content or preparing messages, more than likely some kind of communications role is a great one. If you're great at engaging people to take action, to give, to serve, to attend, that kind of stuff, you're probably going to be great in sales because you're used to getting people to believe in ideas so much that they're willing to take action on it. And it's all in ministry, it's all intangible stuff. In business, it's an exchange of goods and services for money. So it's actually it's a lot easier because there's an exchange of value that's more direct and felt. So those are some of the things I think pastors can look at is like those particular skills. And there's a lot of those jobs out there. And quite honestly, I'll be really shallow again for a second. Like the sales stuff can be very lucrative. I knew a guy at a company I worked at that sold to churches, and he was in his late 20s, I think, when I first met him. And through college and out of college for several years, he worked with YWAM, Youth with a Mission. Great guy. But then he transitioned into sales. By his second year in sales, between his commissions, he was doing $300,000 a year. And he's like, I obviously have to learn the product and all that, like the tactical. He said, I have to learn Salesforce, which as people in ministry get out, nobody actually knows what Salesforce is as you run across that software. But he's like, he just said, I do that. I asked him one time, I was like, what was it like jumping from YWAM to tech sales? He's like, bro, it was actually a lot easier than you think because it's the same skills. I'm building relationships, maintaining relationships, trying to help serve people by solving problems. So it's like, that's such a huge asset that I don't know that people really realize. So again, you think about the pipeline for a lot of church staff. I graduate high school, I go to Bible college and get a theology degree. I go straight into seminary and get an MDiv, and then I go straight into a church.
Yep. I know Bible teachers who are now selling windows and killing it in that
Yeah.
space. But there is something about the money piece, I think, especially for pastors. I know a pastor who was given a brand new, like 70 grand Lexus and like had to make excuses for it every single time because there was somebody in the church that gave it to him and said
Yeah.
like, no, we didn't buy it. We're not getting paid that much. Don't worry. Like we're still getting, paid horribly here at the church. And so, we're not, this is not your worship and your tithe dollars at work in my car. But coming out of that and having a different lifestyle and change, we don't do well with that in the church. But why is it good for Christians to actually make money?
Yeah.
And not necessarily pastors, but like Christians in general,
Christians
right?
in
Like it's
general.
okay to do it.
I don't have I need to probably develop my own teaching on this, or somebody's got to have better than I do. I think in a lot of churches, what I've seen and experienced is money is a point of shame. Like if you want to make money, you're a bad person. Like that's evil. Or, good Christians just want to, or be good where they're at. Without wanting more to do something else. And it's like, but the flip side of that could be maybe you're content with achievement and God's wired you to go achieve and do things. So that, because I would say there's probably a lot of entrepreneurial people in churches and maybe even on church staffs that are very entrepreneurially minded and know that they can take that risk and go build businesses or be more successful and make more money. But one of the reasons I think it's good for Christians to make money and to stop acting like more money is a bad thing is because I don't think we've talked enough in the church about how capitalism can be a great asset for ministry. And what I mean by that is, you and I see this every day because we work with businesses on marketing, and not just marketing in general, but marketing that helps them make money. Like, how do we get more leads who become customers? Because when they become customers, they give you money for it and you make more money. And I've joked a lot of times with Christian business owners, like, I'm going to be really shallow for a second. Let's just go make more money on this, like, because that's fun. But the reality is, what does more money do? If Christians make more money, particularly if they're business owners or leaders, it allows them to hire more people. So you're giving more people dignified work at good wage. And when you do that, that means more people have money. Doesn't always buy happiness. It can buy things that make you happy, like donuts. But it can also buy security. It can help you provide comfort. It can help you support, people in your own life that may need help. If you've got loved ones who are sick and need, there's all kinds of things money can do because money is a tool. We have, for some reason, designated money as a thing that's bad. And we just say the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. But it's not a bad thing to say that by making more money is evil. It's what you do with it. So I think it's good for Christians to rethink, hey, we're in a capitalistic society here in America. Let's leverage that thing for the kingdom. If you want to tackle big issues that are concerning, yeah, the ballot box can be a way to do that, but capitalism can also mean, hey, what if we start giving people more jobs where they can make more money and get out of poverty, and that's going to alleviate a lot of issues because there are way too many people in this country that are at or below the poverty line. I just think if Christians want to use the tools they have available, capitalism is a tool that we as Christians can use to do more good in the world and a real practical thing to meet the needs in the communities that are there.
In the life after ministry world, there's this piece of I'm no longer a pastor, so I don't have that pastoral muscle. There's no place to work it or to leverage it, to use it. We've done a project together in the nonprofit space, but really probably most of what you're doing is not in a Christian environment. You're working with secular companies and people who are not Christian business leaders. But do you ever find that the pastoral urge, muscle, old reflex is there where you're actually in these settings, you're doing ministry?
Yeah. And that's something I think I got to get better at, quite honestly, being more intentional about it. But I think in some ways, I've had clients, I had a prospect, a guy I talked to on a sales call 2 weeks ago, followed up with him. His mom died. And it's like, for example, and it was sudden. He's very, kind of caught off guard and he's doing that. Totally understand. That's a hard season. In some ways when in ministry, this, people only call the church when something bad happens. Like nobody calls and said, hey, I got a promotion. Hey, my kid got into the school they wanted to. We don't get to celebrate the stuff. We have to deal with all the hard stuff. I think in some ways in ministry, you learn a muscle on how to deal with and respond to that, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And so it helps you be better equipped for when those things happen in real life. Because a lot of times, especially in business relationships, people don't necessarily know how to respond to those. So that's one. Like I said, I've worked with a couple hundred organizations over the years, at least. I can't tell you how many of them are run by or staffed with Christians. I mean, it comes up all the time. And so part of it is just being able to support people who are doing good. And then I'll find out things that they're supporting in their communities. I got one client that does a lot here in Georgia that they commit a percentage of profit to some kind of foster program that the state of Georgia, it's some initiative they have. So it's great. Hey, I know if I help them make more money, they can invest more in that, which is a huge need, right? So in some ways, it's like, how do I think about ways from a pastoral perspective to serve people at a personal level when it's necessary, but also, quite honestly, be able to at moments to just speak hard truths, because that's another thing I think great pastors know how to do, is to sit and listen in a moment and realize what's really being said under the surface, and graciously call that out, but still address that, hey, there's a truth here. Now, it's not sin. Usually it's like, hey, I wouldn't do this in sales, but it's still that kind of muscle that I think shows up and helps lead and support people. And then it's opportunities to have conversations that I've had all kinds of conversations about faith over the years, just naturally come up. By the way, I'm going to soapbox again, Matt. I've never had somebody be hostile to me about it. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but sometimes in the church, I think, oh, you go in the workplace and they're going to prosecute you and persecute you for your faith. It's never come up.
Yeah, I agree.
I had my seminary thing on my profile. Like, nobody cares. Nobody. Like, I've worked with a whole range of people all over the world. Nobody cares.
I do think that in the StoryBrand world, we have the guide is the person that shows up and helps somebody win the day. And we say that guides show empathy and authority. And I think that a lot of pastors, I think a lot of them sometimes will have either one or the other really strong on one side. They're all empathy and no authority. And then some are just, we're going to be really dogmatic. But I think if you can find that balance, I think that's in there. It exists within you. If you can show up in that space and realize like that is a really great place for you to meet somebody and then help them to figure out their problem. I think that goes a long way.
I agree.
One more question is, you get to help people. I'm curious even how you say, like, so what do you do now? And then how would you do what you do now to really, like, for a church? This is just give us the 1 minute advice from Wes Gay on how do we tell the story of what the church is doing today?
Yeah. So what I do now is I help people find the right words so they can make or raise more money. Because I primarily deal in the business world. I occasionally work with nonprofits, and I probably once a year work with a church. But that's what I do. So practically what that means for this audience is, like, yesterday I was with a client and they're figuring out they have a really hard time communicating what they do in a clear and concise way. And they're losing a lot of leads and deals as a result. So we come in and use a StoryBrand framework and figure out, how do we need to talk about this for the specific audience we're trying to reach, and the specific audience that's the best fit for us, in a way that's going to give us the greatest likelihood of these people becoming our customers. And then how do we keep them, along the way on the path? For churches, I think one of the biggest things you can do is drop the jargon, because I promise nobody knows what it means. When I first transitioned to that church to become student pastor, our Sunday morning service, the Sunday morning student thing was called Canvas, and Wednesday night was called Exchange. I had no idea what it meant. And so I went into our senior pastor's executive assistant's office, and she had been on staff at that church for 10 years, had been attending at that church for 25. Her youngest of two sons was a senior in high school that year. So she had also been a student ministry mom for 10 years. She was in all the meetings as a senior pastor's assistant. Her husband's great-great-grandfather gave the original land for the first church building in the 1880s. So this family goes back. She knew everybody. She was the most productive person I've ever seen in my life with a pen and legal pad. It was outrageous how much she could get done and her capacity for productivity. So I walked in her office and I sat down and I said, Miss Beth, what do exchange and canvas mean? And she looked at me like you are now, but like a little more confused. And she goes, I don't know, which was not the answer I was expecting. Right. And I said, what do you mean you don't know? She's like, it was like 2 youth pastors ago, they named it. And we had a meeting once on it, and I don't know what it was. And I said, all right, Miss Beth, if you don't know what it means, as somebody who's here every day for work, and and you're very active as a parent of student ministry, your sons are involved. If you don't know what it means, I promise nobody else does. So what if we just call it Sunday morning and Wednesday night? Fine with me. Because when people are reading your bulletin, hearing your announcements, they don't know what that means. It's like one of my jokes. I don't know if you do this, Matt. When I introduce StoryBrand to teams, there's a section in this presentation we give where it talks about when you use confusing language or language that requires more explanation. It's like you're figuratively giving somebody an 8-pound bowling ball, but then covering it in Vaseline and asking them to hold it. Mm-hmm. And the thing we say is you can give somebody 1 or 2 of those, and it's awkward. You're going to fumble around, but you get them 3, they're going to knock out. And the joke I always use is, a lot of churches, they may work I live outside of Atlanta. They might walk into First Atlanta Church on a Sunday morning, and you might walk in with your wife, and let's say you have a high schooler. I don't know if you do, but you got a high schooler. They say, hey, we're so glad you're here. What do you have at First Church for 10th graders? And they may go, well, Collide meets in the attic for Impact. And your first thought is, do they need a medical release form and a helmet? Not, oh, great, you have a program for high school students on Wednesday nights at 6:30. Right. I think the number one thing churches can do to better communicate what you do is to stop using the jargon. Because I promise you, if you say, hey, sign up at information station in a room of 1,000 people, 3 people may know what that is, and they're all in your church payroll.
Right.
Another thing I did one time at a church that I worked at as communications director, I went in the server back when we still had physical servers on site, and I pulled out 5 bulletins from like the past 2 years. And I looked at different event names, and I said, hey, real quick, we're going to have a quiz. I had all the executive staff in the room. It was our executive staff meeting. I said, I'm going to say a name, and you tell me what it was. And there was nobody got any of them right. And some of the events had been planned and run by ministries led by the people in the room.
Right.
My favorite one was Bird Song. And somebody said, is that a music event? I was like, no, it was a women's brunch. And the speaker talked about this. And then they said, what does Bird Song have anything to do with it? I said, I don't know. And then we wonder why our attendance is down. Hey, do you think your wife's going to come to Bird Song?
Yeah.
No. She'll come to women's brunch. I know what that means. Right. So I think the biggest thing churches can do in all the communication, churches, unlike any other industry I've worked with, the volume at which they have to communicate things is really unmatched because you have 52 meetings a year with your essentially audience, which no other industry has. Mm-hmm. And so there's such a high volume of things to communicate. You've got to drop the jargon and speak normal language. That's the biggest thing. I'm going to shout it from the rooftops until churches do it. Stop telling me the names of your events. Stop telling me the meeting room names. Stop using the compass directions to tell me which door to come in. I don't know what the east door is. I worked at a church that used to describe the east parking lot, and I never knew what that was. I had to think, okay, right. I think that way's north, that one. Just say this one on the street. Or they would use 3 street names ago. Just speak normal language.
If they give you a compass with their logo on the back, that might help you find out where you're supposed to be, right?
Yeah, compass and a logo, and say, hey, go to the east parking lot and join us for Impact, and then we're going to go to Exchange, and then we're going to go to, whatever. My joke always is too, if it sounds dangerous, if it's children's ministry or it's youth ministry, and if it's misspelled, it's probably kids ministry. If there's a Z where there should be, it's always kids ministry.
Well, they say, well, we already have the T-shirt and the Instagram handle, so we got to keep it there. It's going to be too hard to change it. I remember I used to run the Un-Halloween party, which actually is very clear. It's We Hate Halloween, but we changed that.
We're too polite in the South. We just say, or here in Atlanta, we just say Fall Festival.
Fall Festival. There you go. We called it Light the Night, which is also probably a little bit confusing, but it's good. Well, hey, Wes, good to have you here. Glad we got to do this. I think we're going to see each other at a couple of conferences coming up next month.
I think so.
Looking forward to that. If somebody wants to learn more about you, what you're up to, and talk to you about their naming of their high school ministry, how did they get in touch with you?
Yeah. Instagram, I'm at Wes Gay. Twitter, I still call it Twitter. I'm Baptist, so I'm slow to change. I'm at Wes Gay, LinkedIn.com/whatever/Wes Gay, Facebook at Wes Gay, and then wesgay.com/life after. You can sign up there. And I send a weekly email out about marketing, messaging. I also love to connect with anybody who is in a ministry role and thinking about it's time to transition out for the sake of better using your skill set, what God's called you to do, but also creating a better environment for yourself and your family. Love to have those conversations. We've taught a lot of folks over the years.
Hey, man. Thanks for being on here.
Thanks for having me.
So thankful for Wes joining us on the podcast today. His story shows that there is life beyond ministry. That is why we're doing this, right? And it doesn't have to be a mystery. It doesn't have to be unsolvable. In fact, we get to work with pastors, ministry leaders, people coming out of nonprofits, missionaries. We help in that process so that they can take skills that they've built and apply them in new ways, whether it's in the business world, the nonprofit sector, or something entirely different. And it really is about understanding your strengths, being open to new opportunities, and realizing that your work in ministry was just one chapter. And there is ministry to come still in whatever you're doing, as long as our hearts are postured in that way that we know that we're here to serve the King in his kingdom. So thanks for tuning in. If this episode resonated with you, don't hesitate to share this with somebody. Don't hesitate to even reach out to Wes and explore some of the resources that we've shared on this episode. Keep moving forward, and we will talk to you next time.